Thank you very much. And what I want to do today is really pose a question which has been on my mind, especially in the last month or so, thinking about this conference. It's a question to which I don't have a clear answer, but I think I'm hoping that people around the room, some of them I think may have an answer to this question. And the question on my mind is, will the Euro project, the adoption of the Euro, eventually lead to fundamental changes in government accounting, both in Europe, but also because Europe is so influential in many other countries around the world. And I'm going to offer some speculative reasons why it might, but also some reasons for caution. The normal case, I think, for governments is that they face relatively weak pressure from outside, external pressures to improve their accounting. There are exceptions. I think the one that Jacob Sol mentioned this morning with the French government in the 18th century is it faced strong pressure from taxpayers to disclose its accounts. But I think the norm is that external pressure for governments to approve accounts is not that strong. And in that sense, governments are quite different. National governments, that is, are quite different from local governments, which can be told what to do, and also from firms. But the Eurozone is somewhat different. In the Eurozone, much more than in any other part of the world, individual governments have an interest in the finances of other governments in the Eurozone, and therefore an interest in their debts and deficits, and therefore an interest in the quality of the measurement of those debts and deficits. And so it creates a pressure which I think is, if not unprecedented, really quite unusual, intergovernmental pressure for improvements in accounting. And although it's true that there have been very large problems in the reporting of public finances in Europe, and those are the problems that I emphasize in the note that is mentioned in the agenda as background reading, the note on fiscal devices and accounting illusions. I think it's also important to recognize that there have been significant improvements in Europe in the area of fiscal statistics. Nowhere else in the world do you get the same sort of external scrutiny of statistics by Eurostat that you do in Europe. Nevertheless, there doesn't seem to be much evidence that this pressure for better measurement of public finances has fed through into better underlying government accounting. What this table does here is look at the governments that the IMF classified as advanced in 2002, the ones in the best position to produce accrual accounts. And it shows how many do it now, recently, and how many did it about 10 years ago. One thing you can see is now that a majority of the central governments in the rich countries of the world do publish accrual-based financial statements. It's now the majority. And also that there's been quite a significant increase in the last 10 years. Countries in the top right cell there are the ones that have changed and improved. So quite a lot of improvement. But it's also noticeable that the Eurozone countries here seem, if anything, like laggards. Certainly some have been producing accrual accounts for a long time, like Spain and Finland. And then there are others that have moved in this last 10-year period, like Austria, under the guidance of Gerhard Steger, and also France. But a lot of laggards there. And that, to me, that sort of creates something of a puzzle in the sense that it seems to me that there is this unusual pressure to improve accounting, and yet no evidence of it there. But it's possible, I think, that the crisis will have changed things. And because it takes a long time to introduce new accounting measures, to produce accrual accounts, you wouldn't expect the crisis to have affected figures in this table. So it seems to me that the Eurozone crisis did quite a lot to reinforce those pressures which were already there. I should stress that I don't mean to argue here that underlying problems in public finances or in the measurement of public finances were a main cause of the crisis in most countries. They were obviously important in Greece, but in other countries like Spain and Ireland, which suffered pretty terrible crises, public finances were seemingly at least in pretty good shape before the crisis. But nevertheless, the crisis has highlighted how important fiscal spillovers are in the Eurozone. Each Eurozone government clearly knows now, if it didn't before, that problems in other Eurozone countries could cause problems for it, and therefore drawn much more attention to debts and deficits. They're in the newspapers. It's clear that people in countries like Germany feel very strongly about problems in reporting in countries in southern Europe like Greece. So they've put the weaknesses in public finances, or weaknesses in the measurement of public finances, in the spotlight. So if my analysis is right, and it may not be, that would seem to create strong pressure for improvements in finances, because there is this new, relatively unusual external pressure for improvements in government accounting to add to the internal desires for improvements. And in particular, if these pressures are there, you can imagine them having several effects. One is strong pressure for standardization of accounting in Europe. That's essentially the EPSIS project, the European Public Sector Accounting Standards Project. And not just standardization, but standardization on an accrual system, in part because the European Union's deficit rule is essentially an accrual-based one. And so in one sense, if I'm right, these pressures will simply reinforce the international trend toward standardized accrual accounting. But also it may lead to some twists, some changes in government accounting, which would be new. One is, as people know, the European Union has a measure of the deficit, which it calls net lending, net borrowing, which is, although it's accrual-based, it's not the same as anything you'd find on a standard income statement, a standard statement of financial performance. It treats investment as assets, as an expense, and it makes a different and sharp distinction between changes that come from transactions and changes that come from capital gains and capital losses. And one might expect that European governments in their accounting and their financial statements may come to use that measure as well as others. And similarly, there may be a new emphasis on the general government sector, which is an idea which is, I guess, different from accounting. It's not based on control. It's the essentially non-commercial parts of the government. So one can imagine that government accounts will show at least segment reporting for a new sector. So potentially, I think, pressures for quite large and interesting changes. But it's not so obvious that these changes are occurring. If they are occurring, they're moving slowly. And I thought it's worth thinking about why that sort of speculation might turn out to be false if it does. And there are many reasons. Probably others that I haven't thought of. But one is obviously the Eurozone, although it's proved resilient so far, may not endure. Or if it does endure, it's possible that it'll move in a different direction where fiscal rules and measurement of the deficit becomes less important. It might become a little bit more like the US monetary union, where a state like, New York State doesn't care very much about the financial problems of California. May care a little bit, but it's nothing like the Eurozone issue. Then it's hard to imagine now, but it's possible that strong burst of unexpected growth or inflation might alleviate the fiscal problems and draw attention away from them. Thirdly, the analysis I gave, I think, is essentially theoretical and abstract and doesn't take into account the apparent fact that the German government, the most important one in the Eurozone, does not, as far as I can tell, isn't convinced of the value of accrual accounting, even though it presumably cares or seems to care a lot about fiscal prudence and the importance of good measurement. And lastly, it's possible, I guess, that even though there are these pressures, it's very hard for the European Union, given its governance, to decide things, and there may be broad agreement on some things, but intensive disagreement about the details. Like the French government might strongly oppose IPSIS, while other governments might be more enthusiastic. So it's not obvious to me which set of incentives will prevail. And I really do have an open mind on this, and I'd actually be very interested in the views of people who know a lot about what's going on in Europe on what they think will happen. So, thank you.